Welcome to episode 133 of the People's History of Ideas podcast. This episode, we're doing something we've never done before on this podcast, and hoping to meet what I see as a real listener need here. I've got a guest on this week, and we're actually, even though this isn't typically an interview podcast, we're going to do an interview. I have with me Dr. Aminda Smith, Associate Professor of Chinese History at Michigan State University and author of Thought Reform and China's Dangerous Classes, which is a fantastic book about thought reform, reform and re-education through labor in the early years of the People's Republic of China. And the reason I'm doing this interview and want to do maybe a couple more interviews over the course of the next year or so is that I hear from a lot of listeners that, they're always contacting me asking for reading suggestions. They want to find other, in-depth, detailed, or more in-depth and detailed academic works on Chinese history. But when they go out there, the things that get pushed to them tend to be things that they don't really like, or they've got kind of an anti-China or anti-progressive stance, and it's kind of hard to find the voices of people who, Chinese historians who, share a lot of the values that I think this podcast is trying to represent. The purpose of this podcast is to be sort of a small way to kind of serve the people, trying to advance historical understanding in the service of a more just and equitable world. So anyways, I'm just rambling. This is Aminda Smith. Say hi to everybody.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here today.
It's a real pleasure. We got to catch up at the last American Historical Association meeting here in Chicago, and I wanted to have you on as my first guest because I love your work, and there was this article that you wrote a few years ago now where you made the argument, which I think is so true, but you understand why it's true and can argue why it's true much better than I can, which is that good PRC history is left history. That is, good history of the People's Republic of China is left history. And I was thinking that would be a great way to kick off this discussion if you could elaborate on why you think that.
Yeah, well, first of all, I guess it's important to clarify that I'm not saying that historians or the history that they write has to take a leftist political stance. Some really good PRC history doesn't, but rather, that we can't understand the history of the PRC without taking seriously and really mapping out the leftist logics that animated the Chinese Revolution. And it might seem like an obvious point to some, but as you said, if you go out there and you look at the Chinese history that is maybe most prominent or kind of, recommended as, the best stuff on what happened during the Chinese Revolution, there are not that many people who take those logics seriously. I think there is a growing group now who's doing that, but it's still rare to just encounter that if you're out there looking. And the dominant narrative in both specialist scholarship and more public-facing history has been that Maoism was mostly illogical, right? Evil, maybe even sometimes, and that people either knew that, and were kind of cynically using it to their own benefit, or that they didn't know that because they were duped, by Mao or by others. But that dominant narrative is just simply false, right? I mean, your listeners know that Maoism had a powerful set of logics, and it inspired people around the world. And during the PRC period, the vast majority of people were making genuine efforts to think through those logics and to use them. That doesn't mean they always agreed. They didn't, right? There was lots of debate and lots of discussion about this. And even when they did agree, they didn't always follow the logics. I sometimes say that, Mao himself wasn't always a very good Maoist. In fact, sometimes he was one of the worst. But the efforts to try to understand those Maoist logics and to try to put them into practice really shaped the way that people experienced the PRC and the way that events unfolded. I mean, and honestly, the logics were sound, right? I mean, some of them were pretty hardcore. They advocated levels of violence that, make people uncomfortable, make me uncomfortable. Certainly, I wouldn't advocate for that. Um, but they weren't illogical, right? They had their own logics, or at least they weren't any less logical or less consistent than any other major, political ideology. And again, I would argue that some of the worst excesses of the Mao years happened when people strayed from those logics, more so than when they really followed them consistently.
Wow, there's a lot to potentially follow up on there. But one of the things you said is there's a growing group of scholars taking this approach. Now, it seems to me like back in the Mao years, there were a bunch of people who liked what was going on in China. And in your article, and I'll put a link in the show notes to this article, you talk about sort of a disillusioned generation and kind of a post-disillusionment generation. Can you describe sort of the trajectory of like, people like China, people don't like China? Where are these new scholars coming from? Are these bunch of young guns, or what's going on?
Yeah, well, I guess I was one of the young guns many years ago, so I guess maybe it's not so new after all. But it still feels new in the sense that we're just barely breaking into those dominant narratives. But yeah, I mean, essentially, in the 60s, in the 70s, there were a number of historians, political scientists, and other scholars of China, as well as activists and others who were looking to the People's Republic of China, to the Chinese Revolution, as an example of a kind of a reinvigorated Marxism, a reinvigorated path maybe towards some of the progress that they felt had kind of stalled in the Cold War period towards social change and the growth of socialist reforms around the world. And they really saw China as possibly heralding a new age of this, and they were very excited about what was going on there, following it closely. And they wrote about their excitement. They were sort of, China boosters. They were Mao boosters. And the people that I'm talking about are mostly academics, right? And at least in this particular argument, I wasn't thinking about people like the Black Panthers or people like, French Maoist philosophers. I was really looking at the historians who eventually would train me, for example, in PhD programs in the US. But those people eventually experienced what they portrayed as a disillusionment. So, they say that for a long time, of course, people from the US couldn't go to China after the Korean War, during the Cultural Revolution. It was difficult to get there if you had a US passport. So in the 70s, they're all invited to go, and they go over there. And at first they see, kind of a showcase, right, of all of the things that are still going great with socialism. But many of them claim that while they were there, they also saw evidence that it was all kind of a facade, right? And then over time, they learned more. They say this is their narrative about what really had happened in China. They learn about the famine of the Great Leap Forward. They learn about the excesses of the Cultural Revolution. And they themselves decide that Maoism was, in fact, a great idea, but that in practice, it ended up being not much more than a facade for a kind of a power grab by the state. And so and this was a profound disillusionment for them, right? They built their whole careers on their love for this place and for these politics and for the revolution that had been so inspirational to them. And so they experienced it like a personal betrayal. And they were angry, and they wrote angry denouncements of China and the Chinese Revolution. And they were our teachers, right? So like when I got to graduate school, those were the people who were teaching us. But what they said was, go find the truth, right? Now that these archives are finally opening, we had access that they didn't have to the sources that the Communist Party itself had kept. And they instructed us to go in there, be empiricists, don't believe anything the party tells you, and just read the history. And we went in and we read it, and we came up with something a little bit different, because we started to work through those logics and to watch how things had unfolded in these very grassroots sources. And we thought, actually, it wasn't a facade, right? There was something more complicated than that going on. And so we started to write these histories that at the very least took seriously the project, not as a facade, but as something that was unfinished and that went tragically wrong in many places, but not as something that was ill-intentioned from the very start, actually as something that was a genuine effort, right? To help ordinary people kind of change their worlds and their lives.
So you've got all these scholars, they love China, then they get disillusioned, they train you guys, they send you off, you guys come back. Now, what's your relationship with your former mentors? Is this is this Darth Vader and Obi-Wan Kenobi? What's going on when you come back and you're saying different things? Are these guys, I mean, I guess, are they, maybe it's not a uniform reaction, but I mean, do you guys suffer career consequences from taking a more pro-Mao line, to put it kind of simplistically?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no, right? There were members of that generation who were pretty excited to see these kind of viewpoints coming out. I mean, and again, we were trying really hard not to be overly idealistic. We were like, yeah, look, like there's a bad side to a lot of this history, but we want to figure it out by taking seriously what they were trying to do, and then really analyzing why, in some cases, it ends up with excesses and disasters. And so I think some of them really appreciated it, but there were those among them who just sort of reverted back to what they already thought. They just said, oh, well, these kids are idealistic like we were, but they're worse because we at least didn't know any better. Like, they know the history and they're still, running this line that Maoism wasn't so bad. And they've just been duped by the Communist Party as well. Even though, I mean, it wasn't like most of us were like hanging out with the Communist Party, whoever they are. I mean, we were there in Beijing and Shanghai, out in various villages, wherever we were working. I was working in Beijing, just sort of living in an apartment complex, talking to ordinary people and going to the archives. So, it wasn't like we had the kind of connections where we were getting our information directly from, party leaders, and no party leaders were talking to us in those years, right? This was really a very grassroots project that we were doing. But yeah, there were, I mean, I don't know if there were long-term career consequences, because it's difficult to know about the people who tried to publish papers that were too pro-PRC and sort of found themselves out of the academy. I only know about the people who were my friends and colleagues who did manage to kind of push our way into jobs and into the fields. But yeah, I think our papers all got rejected in the beginning. I almost didn't get tenure because I had a really hard time finding a publisher for my book. And I don't know how much of that was the collapse of publishing and how much of it was the fact that I said that thought reform, didn't end up being so great, but started out, as a kind of a legitimate political project. But yeah, I think there were certainly consequences for the field, right? Because those people had a lot of power. They controlled, who got the big grants in a lot of cases. They controlled who got the big jobs. And I do think that people who were really running a kind of as you would say, a slightly more pro-Mao line were, and still are, passed over for a lot of opportunities, because you get one reviewer who just says, well, this person's an idiot. Right? They still think that Maoism was a good thing, which, by the way, to clarify, isn't exactly what we're saying.
Right. I'm kind of simplifying here for sure, and maybe putting some of my own biases into
that's
reading what you're saying. It's like the example, like Stephen Andor's, right? His book China's Industrial Revolution is, for me, just one of the most amazing books. Although I've actually wanted to ask somebody like you or another China scholar for some time, just how much is the book really as accurate as it seems like it is, because it seems like he didn't get tenure. This, of course, we're talking about the people who suffered as their colleagues became disillusioned, right? But that was I love that book, and he's the big figure for me of people who suffered real consequences in the field, despite creating what seems to me as someone who's not really trained trained minimally as a China scholar, as a secondary field in grad school, but that, he stands out as the big figure of, wow, this is, they're not giving these people jobs and stuff like that. But, you guys have managed to push your way into the field. You're getting published. You guys have a sort of whole, online presence, around, positions politics, and the HPRC group. Of course, me mentioning this now means you may get a bunch of people checking that stuff out.
That's great.
Which hopefully this is it's a signal to you guys listening to this. Go check that stuff out online. I'll put links in the show notes. So just how big of a section of, like, say, the people, like, I don't know, percentage wise, or how big is this cohort of people who doing this sort of history within, as a percentage of people doing modern Chinese history or history of the People's Republic of China today?
Well, I think it's getting bigger. I think one thing that we, managed to do, all of the people who are involved in, like HPRC and positions politics and all these groups, one of the things that they've managed to do over the years is to at least insist that, if you want to get an article published in the field of PRC history, you have to at least take the logic seriously a little bit, right? Not that everybody still does, but you can no longer, you used to be able to say things in papers that would get published in major scholarly journals that would say things like, well, obviously this was all a lie. The party just did this to, pull the wool over everyone's eyes. So what really happened was this other thing. And now I think it's a little bit harder to say that sort of stuff, at least in peer-reviewed publications. I think in, like, airport books, you can still say whatever you want. And those, unfortunately, are some of the most read sources on this history. So I think that's one thing that we did. But I also think we have a younger generation of graduate students who are themselves kind of experiencing a revitalization of socialist hope, right? And so they don't want to dismiss this outright. They understand that there were tragedies associated with the socialist experiments of the 20th century, but they also see that there were successes and that there are lessons. And so they are going into this with a really different mindset. And I don't think that's got anything to do with anything that, like my generation of scholars did. I think that's a global shift. And I think these global shifts are important, right? When you talk about Andors and others who lost their jobs at the beginning of the disillusionment, I think part of that also has to do with the fact that they had a kind of a McCarthyist Cold War and very post-Cold War political context against them, right? On the side of those who wanted to kind of run them out of the academy. That at that time, anybody who would dare say anything good about communism, didn't have a place in U.S. universities, according to some of the mainstream views. And then there was a period of time where that just wasn't the case. Like when I was a grad student and trying to get a job, nobody was really afraid of communists anymore. I mean, there was even a headline in The Onion, right? Communists now 98th least feared group in the US or something like that. So nobody cared that we were sitting over here being like, well, maybe Maoism wasn't so bad. But now I think that's changing again. And those of us who do this kind of work have been doxxed, harassed for indoctrinating students or things like this in Chinese communist ideology. So I think that the global situation is important to remember when you think about what happens to scholars who take a more sort of pro-communist view.
So maybe now would be a good time to shift into talking more about your particular how this perspective shows up in your own work. When I first learned about your work at not this past American Historical Association meeting, but when you gave a paper at the American Historical Association, the last time before that, it was in Chicago. What was that? Probably 2019?
Yeah, I think so.
And you were giving a paper on brainwashing. And it was funny. I was going to the panel because there was somebody, giving a talk on early drafts of William Hinton's Fan Shen, which was also a great paper. Brian DeMare, I think it was.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right.
And and I was like, oh, this lady's going to talk about brainwashing. This is going to be terrible. This is going to be so bad. I don't know maybe I'll look at my phone. But it turned out to be, oh wait, she's pro brainwashing. This is fantastic. So maybe I'm being a little facile about this, but maybe you could explain why brainwashing's a good thing.
Yeah. I do have a recent article called In Defense of Brainwashing.
I've seen it.
Well, when I teach about this topic, I always start with news footage from the Korean War, in which these U.S. soldiers are making speeches denouncing the U.S., right, which they called imperialist, and offering support for China, for North Korea, and for communism. And these were all soldiers who were being held in North Korean prisoners of war camps. And the camps for foreigners were being managed by the Chinese communists, right, who had entered the war to support the North Koreans. And in 1954, the U.S. soldiers start making these anti-U.S., pro-communist news broadcasts. And there's one great moment in one when a prisoner, yells to the other prisoners, "Does anybody want to go home?" And they all yell, "No!" And this is like 1954, and they're and so obviously people in the U.S. are so horrified when they see this that they assume that the Chinese must have invented some kind of sinister mind control tactic. And a CIA agent named Edward Hunter reports that, yes, this is true. The Chinese have developed a new technology, and the Chinese communists themselves call it brainwashing, Hunter says. And most of this, actually, if you read scholarship by U.S. historians about brainwashing, they'll kind of argue that it was a figment of a U.S. imagination, right? They'll say that, well, the Chinese tactics weren't really all that different from the psychological warfare that most countries were using, including the U.S. And this kind of mass hysteria tells you more about like what's going on in the US and like what Americans are afraid of. And it even becomes kind of a joke to the point that, it's mocked in The Manchurian Candidate, right? The film where a Chinese doctor, brainwashes someone and then he says something like, his brain hasn't just been washed, it's been dry cleaned. And everyone laughs, right? It's like, when I show this in my class, we all laugh. But actually, like, it's not that funny, because treating Chinese thought reform efforts as a joke actually bolsters that kind of post-Cold War claim that there's no alternative to capitalism, right? Or to US style liberal democracy. It paints socialist logics as a joke, or as nothing, right? They weren't really, nothing to do with socialism or Maoism. They were just in there, using regular psychological warfare techniques. There was no there, right? Treating it like that instead of what it was, which was like a really powerful and genuine challenge to the idea that the world has to be the way that it is. And what those Chinese communists were doing in their thought reform efforts, both with foreign soldiers in prisoner of war camps, but also domestically within China, was asking people to question what they'd been told about the nature of the world and kind of how things had to be. Of course, if people resisted that process, there was an element of force. And, when I first wrote about thought reform, I don't think I was sufficiently critical of the incarceration piece of this. And somebody actually once, I was at a conference in Germany, and a German scholar asked me whether what she thought was kind of a pro-incarceration bias was due to the fact that I am from the US, right, where mass incarceration is just completely normalized as a way to deal with stuff. And I thought a lot about that, and I engaged in a series of self-criticisms and realized that was probably true. So I think if I would write the book today, I would think about it a little bit differently. But at least ideally, the initial process really was supposed to be just asking people to question what they believe to be true. One of my favorite all-time quotes is from a man named Clarence Adams. And he was a U.S. soldier who was held in one of those Korean War camps. And he spoke in one of those radio broadcasts. And he actually refused repatriation to the U.S. after the Korean War. He was one who chose to move to China. He said, "I'm not going to go back to the U.S. until it's not fascist." And he stayed in China for years. During which he continued to denounce the U.S. He made radio broadcasts for Vietnam War soldiers, right, saying, don't do this. The U.S. is bad. You should, stand up against them rather than fighting their wars. But eventually, he went back to the U.S. And years later, somebody asked him if he'd been brainwashed by the Chinese communists. And he said, "Brainwashed? They didn't brainwash me. They unbrainwashed me."
Oh, that's a great quote. That's a great quote. Yeah, I really appreciated your book. Now I have to re-examine my own American socialization and pro mass incarceration socialization myself, because I really loved your book, and I sort of revisited it in the past couple weeks in preparation for this interview. And one thing that stood out to me about it was that, you read about, and this is why I want this is what I think is so great about the work being produced by you guys today compared to some of the stuff that was produced like in the 70s and 60s that people couldn't produce because they didn't have the archival sources. So they couldn't go into the level of detail. As you read about, well, okay, there's a celebration in the literature from the time, right? I'm talking about the 60s, 70s stuff. It's like, oh, there's no more prostitution in China's big cities now. There's no more beggars on the streets. Um, They've eliminated drug addiction. But the actual process, just in your gut that there's a back and forth. It's like, okay, we're eliminating the social bases and that gets a lot of people off it, but people have ingrained habits. So there's going to be some coercion. So what does it actually look like when you go and do it? And so, for readers who are curious, you deal with this period between roughly between 49 and 57, between, liberation and the anti-rightist campaign, where you actually talk in detail about the process by which vagrants and prostitutes were, were rehabilitated. And so that just fills in such a big hole, because I think for people that aren't predisposed to a progressive worldview, a lot of that stuff from the 60s and 70s comes off as kind of a triumphalist narrative, which they don't find very convincing. But if you actually here are the archives, show me the receipts, right? Here's the archival sources. Here we're showing you exactly how they did it, what happened, what was the combination of coercion and persuasion, what were their motivations, what did it look like in practice, what were all the weaknesses, of course, by the fact that they had to, rely in many cases on, people who had been Kuomintang police to carry out some of this, the real world weaknesses, but also what they still managed to accomplish. It makes, for me, for a much more powerful narrative, even though in many ways much more dispassionate than what the stuff written in the 60s and 70s. So that, I think that's emblematic of the strength of this new scholarship that people from your cohort of historians are putting out, and that's one of the reasons I want to have you on and drive people towards you and some of your other colleagues' work to get that kind of more convincing, more powerful. You can read that stuff, and then you can go out and be so much more convincing in if this. And I'm not saying this is what you or any of these other historians want to do. You guys are historians. I don't want to get anybody in trouble. You guys are being historians. You're not trying to change the world, right? But but for people who do want to change the world, going and reading this stuff, you actually have so much more powerful arguments once you've assimilated this material.
I think one of the things that really comes out, though, when you look at this material is something that both I think is inspirational, but also a little harrowing for people who want to change the world, which is that it's hard to do that, right? I mean, they had like what seems like the ideal project. They were like, we are going to get people who have been reduced to the point that they are having to beg on the streets. Most of them are not happy about it, right? You encounter a few beggars who are like, no, I'd rather be a beggar, right? You get a little bit of that, of course. Same with the sex workers. You get women who say, actually, I was working at a relatively high class brothel. I'd rather do that than, be a communist. But for the most part, the people that they round up want a different life, right? A lot of them were sold into prostitution, or they were farmers who would rather much more be home in their home villages farming the land, but they can't, right? Because drought and other kinds of disasters have driven them off their land, and now they're begging in the cities. And they bring these people into these re-education centers where they feed them and they clothe them and they give them medical care, and they say, hey, why do you think your life is so bad? And all the people in the re-education center say, oh, it's fate. And they go, no, right? It's the landlords, it's the capitalists, it's these people. And we're going to help you like take your life back and do something else with it. And these people are excited. And, some of these people, they talk about their experiences. They give oral history reviews much, much later after there's no more pressure to pretend, anything anymore. And they still say, yeah, actually, this changed my life. To be given this powerful opportunity to change my life, and with the support of the entire state saying that my life and my voice and my experiences mattered. But yet, nonetheless, in the 80s, sex work comes back, right? Vagrancy comes back. We see a reversal, maybe, from some of the socialist progress they made back to sort of more capitalist social problems. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it really hits home something that Mao always says, which was that, the revolution is guaranteed to succeed, but it's also guaranteed to fail.
Yeah. Yeah. What was that quote where he was talking with W.B. Du Bois, where he was like, and W.B. Du Bois was like, wow, I've just done all these things and I've failed. And I'm paraphrasing here. I don't remember the exact quote, but it was something like, that's what you do. You fight, fail, fight. Well, he said this in other contexts too: fight, fail, fight, fail, fight, fail, win. He said that several times in his works, but he had a particular version of that with W.B. Du Bois. I'm sure anybody wants to Google W.B. Du Bois and Mao, you can find the quote. Anyways, you at the AHA this past time, you were on 2 panels. And the one Sunday morning, sort of building on what we were just talking about, you took a really novel approach to defending global Maoism and its understanding of what was going on in China. The approach that I'm more used to, and the approach I've tended to take in my own work, has been to say, all these is to emphasize the people-to-people ties and the organizational networks in common between people in other countries and what was going on in China. And of course, for people who aren't familiar with one of the big historical, I don't know, probably controversy is a little bit too much, but one of the historical misunderstandings about global Maoism is this idea. It's the title of a major book on French Maoism by Richard Wolin, Revolution, that the revolution was just in the air. And that's not a terrible book. There's a lot of great things in that book, but there is this sort of fundamental misunderstanding that these people outside of China just didn't know anything about what was going on in China. And the main way people like me and other people have talked about how these people actually knew what was going on in China is to show these people were going to China. They were part of organized international networks. These people actually knew quite a bit about what was going on in China. You take this even, I think, incredibly bold approach, which is say, look, these people were reading propaganda produced in China, and you know what? This propaganda was basically accurate. So they knew what was going on. And I was like, wow, you're going to get some pushback on that, but that is bold. But then, of course, you substantiate it again with your research. So can you just speak about some of that process and what's going on there?
Yeah. So I guess by basically accurate, I do also mean that it was totally idealized as propaganda, right? But that there are basic facts in there and reflections of experiences that people are having that were really true, and that's what inspired these global Maoists. But yeah, I mean, and I got to this actually by thinking about the kind of work that you and others are doing, which really has already dismantled this idea that nobody knew what was going on in communist China. I mean, sure, a lot of people from the US weren't able to go over, right? They couldn't get a visa, although certain groups were, of course. But people from all over the rest of the world were going. And so it's not at all true that nobody knew what was going on in communist China until after the fact. But I thought, well, what about people who don't get the chance to go? What would they get from this propaganda? And, they could buy in the 60s and the 70s and beyond that, these pamphlets and other things, of course, translations of Mao Zedong thought, things like that, in the leftist China bookstores in major cities in the US. And these materials even made their way to smaller places in Boise, Idaho, where I went to high school. Into the 90s, there were a few of these things hanging around in the libraries of the grassroots political organizations that I would frequent. And some of them were pretty boring for a young person like me, but others were really interesting because they were essentially stories about how Maoism in China had inspired people to change their lives, right, and to change their practical conditions. And one of the pamphlets that I talked about in that paper that you mentioned at the AHA was called Philosophy is No Mystery. And this has been digitized. It's online. Anybody can Google it and find it in lots of languages, including English and Chinese. So we can put a note for people or a link for people. But essentially, it's a group or it's a story about a group of farmers in the early 1970s who are experiencing some conflicts in their village. And one of them is over ponds, right? They have these ponds in the village. And after the Great Leap Forward, after the famine, there was a kind of a pullback from full-scale collectivization in the aftermath of the disaster. And so some of the ponds that during the Great Leap had been totally for collective use started to be kind of rented out to individuals for fish breeding. And they were eating these fish, but also like selling these fish, using these fish for profit, essentially. But there are also people who want to use those ponds for collective irrigation. They're like, okay, we got to get back to collectivization. Let's use these ponds for things that will benefit everyone, like irrigating our fields. And there's a kind of a simmering conflict, but then there's a drought. And, the rice crop is starting to kind of die in the fields. So the conflict is heightened with one side arguing, we got to drain those ponds. Or all of our rice is going to die. But then the people who own the fish in the ponds being like, well, my fish are going to die. And one of the ways that the pamphlet is idealized is that, supposedly a village Communist Party leader says something like, oh, what a bunch of contradictions. How would we know how to sort them out? And then he goes, aha, didn't Mao Zedong have something to say about contradictions? But in any case, they do start reading Mao's work. These are farmers. They've had some basic literacy education recently, but on contradiction, while not the toughest philosophical text, is not the easiest thing either. And they have a hard time. They get some local high school students to help them. They have actually eventually some philosophers come from the cities to kind of help them make their way through these things. But those philosophers later attest that the farmers were already kind of getting a sense of some of the main ideas. And one of the things that they got from this was that, Mao had this really important point to do with solving problems by identifying the primary contradiction, right? So what is the most significant political struggle that you're facing at any given moment? And whatever that fight is, that should shape how you interpret and respond to situations. And these villagers know, they've been told, but they claim that they agree, that the primary contradiction in the early 70s in the PRC was between those who wanted to push forward with the socialist road, no matter how difficult that was, and it was difficult, or wanted to kind of roll things back, be more moderate, or even, kind of go back to a capitalist road. And in that context, villagers realize, well, if we're Maoists, we want to push for the socialist road, and therefore collective use of ponds wins, private economic use of ponds loses. And yes, okay, so the story was idealized in certain ways. But one of the things I argue in that paper is that the very fact that it was idealized to teach key elements of Maoist theory meant that consumers of this propaganda were learning key elements of Maoist theory. So to say they don't know anything about Maoism doesn't make any sense. They learned a pretty important point about Maoism, which is thinking about, primary versus secondary contradictions. And they saw some really practical ways that you could employ this in your life in both political and economic situations. But the pamphlet also defends the global Maoists in another way because, in fact, now we know that these stories were true. They were idealized, but they were true. So the people in this philosophy village, for example, have told their story. They've given oral histories. They've written their own stories. Journalists, historians, everybody has been out there to talk to them. And they will all tell you about their experience learning to be Maoist philosophers. Now, they have very different opinions. Some still think it was great. Others are like, oh, yeah, we should have just been pursuing capitalism and getting rich, right? What a waste of my time. But the point is they don't deny that they did it, that it was real, and that it was powerful at the time, and that they did, in fact, learn to work with these Maoist ideas. It's just that some don't think those Maoist ideas were ever good, while some are still arguing that they were. So in a sense, if you read that pamphlet, you learned about something that was going on in a village in China that you would have otherwise never known about, right? And it's accessible and easy to read. Mm-hmm. So even people who weren't able to go to China, it's not like when people read Chinese communist propaganda, even if they're left-wing thinkers. It's not like they believe all of it. I mean, none of us believe every single thing we read in the news, but they're understanding that there's some truth in there, and that's what they're taking from it.
And when you gave this talk Sunday morning, it sounded like there's a number of people involved in this project of going back and sort of substantiating, sort of some essential claims from this old this old work. That was my sense, at least. Is that the case? This is an ongoing project? Is this mainly U.S. historians, Chinese historians, others?
No, it's definitely, I mean, I think it's most of the people who are doing it are historians, Chinese historians working in China, who, are going out, conducting oral histories. They've compiled lots and lots of oral histories, but there are some historians from other countries who are doing this as well. And sometimes, I mean, I don't know that it's like a cohesive project, right? Sometimes this just happens in the sense that, well, you're interested in these philosophers at this philosophy village. So now you can sort of Google the town and you can see, oh, they've got a museum about the philosophy village, and you can go there. Anyone can go there, right? And you can look at the stuff that they've got. They'll have local artifacts. But often the person who runs the museum will be one of the people who was involved in this effort. A lot of times they've started these museums themselves, right? Because they're kind of proud of the fact that they had this global fame. Same with barefoot doctors. You can go out to a town where these barefoot doctors, right, who were farmers themselves, who learned some rudimentary medical training during the Cultural Revolution and provided it where it wasn't otherwise available. And they're really proud of that experience. So they've, created little, very, very grassroots museums, or they've told their story to local people. And so sometimes you find it by accident. You just end up sort of talking to these people who go, oh, yeah, we did that, and this is what it meant. Plus, they've been interviewed by journalists. So if you can read Chinese, you just Google these things, and interviews with them by Chinese journalists pop up. Of course, if you're a historian, you want to go out yourself and verify that stuff. But even just by Googling it and feeding it into an AI translator, anybody could get a sense of this kind of stuff.
So this brings this relates to a point you made Friday night's panel. You said something really interesting. It kind of goes under the Maoism isn't entirely dead in China. At least that's the heading I put it under. Is that you said that in Chinese in China today, even though the party and the state are not socialist anymore, that there's a lot of really first-rate Marxist work being produced as kind of a legacy of China's Maoist tradition and ongoing promotion and education in Marxist ideas, right? I think you said that there was cultural, political, analytical, all kinds of work of just first-rate Marxist analysis being produced. And I wanted to ask at the time, but I there was only so much time at the panel. But now I can ask you, and you've got time to respond. What can you characterize some of this? Is it and is any of it available in English? And do these people suffer repercussions for, or is the state funding this stuff? I just a lot of really basic questions about this.
Yeah. Well, the kind of stuff that I'm talking about, which I'll explain a little bit more about in a second, is less available in English. What tends to be available in English is the kind of Marxist analysis or pro-Marxist stuff tends to be by people who might be categorized kind of more as like loyalists, people who are pretty supportive of today's Chinese Communist Party and think that it still is, in fact, kind of a socialist vanguard, leading China through a very long revolution to socialism. That's most of what's available in English. The stuff that I was talking about is people who are Chinese, are Marxists, are not necessarily supportive of at least the mainstream of today's Chinese Communist Party. A lot of them will say that there are people in the Chinese Communist Party who are real Marxists, right? But some of the people that I was talking about don't think that the mainstream views of the Chinese Communist Party are necessarily still Marxist. They do get in trouble. Everything from, some of these well, probably the most famous group of these people were a group of students from Beijing University who went and sort of lent their energy to a strike of workers. Um, and they all got they got in trouble. They lost their place at the university in some cases. They were subject to discipline. We can put a link in the show notes if you want to some stories about that event. But also some of them will be posting things online, and their sites will be wiped out. Sometimes they'll get, usually they'll get a knock on the door from the police. So this isn't it isn't without risks to do this, but it's also the case that at least some people can remain relatively anonymous online, and so are able to kind of keep this going and keep mirroring sites that go down or taken down, this sort of thing. And what these people are doing, essentially, I mean, first of all, it's really important to note that part of my argument in that paper was that it really matters that these people grew up in a country that claims to be socialist. We could have a whole other debate about what people think about that, about whether China today is socialist. But it really matters that, for example, students are required to take classes on Marxism at school, because those classes are actually not that bad. I mean, they're kind of boring in the way that an American government class maybe is sort of boring in certain ways, but it does sort of get at the basics of what Marxism is. So, for example, I had a graduate student who arrived in the US a few years ago, and she was kind of, humbly bragging about how she knew more about Marxism than anybody in any of her critical theory class in the US, right? She was like nailing it every time because she really knew this stuff. And it was basically from these state classes, right? But at the same time, it's also the case that there's all of this earlier Marxist culture that's still kind of floating around China, like that pamphlet that I was talking about. I mean, there were 2 or 3 of these things where I was growing up. I mean, imagine how many of these things there are in the homes of like the grandmothers and the parents of these kids, right? They're growing up in houses where if they're bored on a Sunday, what they go find in a stack of old papers is some pamphlet about Maoism. And a lot of the Chinese Marxists that I know are people who were consuming that stuff, that old propaganda, talking to their grandparents about it, but also taking these classes in Marxism, and they were putting that all together, and that formed the basis of their worldview, right? So they really are, in a lot of ways, growing up as trained Marxists, I guess, in the same way that, somebody who studies hard in a U.S. college, knows something about our political systems, right? And the theory that underlie those. And that's a great starting foundation for them then to teach themselves more or go abroad to other universities and study Marxism. And so they're using that to produce, I think, some of the most sophisticated Marxist analyses, film analyses, right? Which try to, there was there is a great article in English that summarizes the work of one of these people who was kind of, defending the goals of the Cultural Revolution through a series of film reviews, right? I can share that piece with people. Everything from that to, writing entire dissertations in Marxist theory. And so I think that China's socialist legacy means that if you care about Marxism, you have to pay attention to what's happening in China, and you can't let people say, "Oh, no, Chinese Marxism isn't real. That's just some smokescreen from the Communist Party." It's not true. Chinese Marxism is an important tradition, and anybody who wants to understand Marxism should be paying attention insofar as you can, right? When not everything is translated.
Right. Yeah. I mean, when you think about it for a minute, it only makes sense. If we can have Marxists here in the United States, they've got to be able to have them anywhere else in the world, especially China.
Right.
Cool. I want to respect your time here, so I don't know how much time you have. We've been going about 53 minutes. I think one thing I definitely want to get in is, my listeners are always my readers. My listeners are always writing in asking for like book recommendations, and I feel like my standard responses have been okay, but they could be a lot better, Right. I tend to, people looking for textbooks, I tend to point them towards, Spence's Search for Modern China or Yang Wen-Zheng's 10 Lessons in Modern Chinese History. If they're looking for something more just PRC specific, maybe Maurice Meisner's book. And if they're looking for kind of a good overview that's not really a textbook, it's more engaging, I'll point them towards Spence's Gate of Heavenly Peace. But I feel like you might have better recommendations than I have for accessible introductory texts. And also, we've talked about this cohort of other historians like you who are producing work. I'm not going to ask you to name all of them because inevitably you would leave somebody out and they would be upset, and that would just be a mean thing to do to you. But perhaps there's I've already mentioned there's places where you can see work by these people, such as Positions and HPRC, H-PRC. It's part of something called HNet, which is a humanities academic online network. But maybe there are just a handful of books produced by this cohort of people that are really good introductions to this sort of work. And maybe there's not. I don't know. Maybe all of it is locked behind being priced for only academic libraries to buy and stuff like that. But if there are two or three or four really good introductions to the work of this cohort, if you could recommend them, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, well, I think for a really good introduction of kind of China in the 20th century from a left perspective, there's Rebecca Karl's Mao Zedong and China in the 20th Century World, which it is about Mao, but it also really introduces you to the currents that shaped the Chinese Revolution. And she is, a leader in taking this stuff seriously, taking Mao seriously, not uncritically by any means, right? And so that's a great place to start. I do think that there is a lack of really kind of broadly accessible stuff that takes this position, other than there are a few memoirs and things by Red Guards and other people in China during the Cultural Revolution who didn't ever quite give in to the push to treat this as though it was just a kind of an illogical anathema, right? And I can certainly share some links to some of those, but I think it is unfortunate that right now the stuff that is more accessible tends to take what I think is an easier, actually, and more simplistic position, right? Which is that position that this was just nothing but illogical tragedy. I hope that as the field that I'm in matures, more people will write things that are more accessible. I mean, certainly for now, for those of your listeners who do like a slightly more academic stuff, I mean, the PRC History Review, which is on HPRC, and then also Positions Politics does have shorter form kind of, let's talk about a political issue that's being kind of, roundly portrayed in an anti-communist way and give a sort of a left appraisal, but it is a bit more academic. I mean, I think maybe what we need is a movement to serve the people here, history for the people in PRC history, and start trying to get this perspective out a little bit more. I think most people who look for this kind of perspective go to you, actually.
Well, they're in trouble. I need to start prioritizing podcast production a little more highly.
That's right. This is where I send everybody. So sorry.
Oh, wow. That's I don't know what to say. That's nice to hear. Cool. Well, you've got another book coming out, right?
That theoretically.
Theoretically. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, well, so the book, tentatively called The Good Maoist, is not about a single good Maoist or the idea that anybody is a good Maoist, but that there would be a way to be a good Maoist. And, what is that, right? What really was Maoism about? What were its logics? What were they trying to do? And if somebody were a good Maoist from start to finish, what would that look like? And it goes from the early 20th century through about the 1980s, and it looks at stories of people who tried to think and practice like Maoists. So stories like those people in Philosophy Village, right?
Mm-hmm.
Stories like that. of people who found this meaningful, found it useful. And really, I'm writing it precisely because of what we talked about at the very beginning and what we were just talking about now, the fact that the dominant narrative just, says that this was all completely illogical. And that not only is that like historically inaccurate, such that if you go in thinking this is illogical and then you watch it, nothing makes any sense, and you go back out and report that it's illogical, but it's also, kind of an injustice, right? Because most of the people who worked with Maoist logics in their lives in a place like China were actually trying to, make real change in their lives. They were trying to improve their communities. And in a lot of cases, they did. And they made real changes in their own lives and the lives of their communities. And that was really, really important to them. And to let, Mao Zedong or anybody else kind of stand for that whole movement, right? To let a group of elites kind of stand for that whole thing is a historical injustice. And so I'm trying to tell more of those stories, but while also talking about, well, what was Mao thinking? What were the elites doing? How did this, set of logics result in things that seem to be so inconsistent with that logic that they led people to say that it was always kind of BS from the start, right? To look at the ways that those logics either were abandoned or in some cases, going back to what I said before, it was just really, really difficult to put these logics into practice, right? I mean, Maoism was supposed to be a whole-scale reevaluation and critique of the dominant logics that governed the culture of the society and the economy essentially all over the world in the 20th century. I mean, obviously, that's going to be really difficult. And sometimes neither Mao nor anybody else could really break away from the logics of progressive capitalist developmentalism, right? They're still there. And the book kind of argues that those currents were as responsible for tragedy as any socialist or Maoist claims.
That sounds like an amazing book. When can we look forward to seeing it?
Next year.
Next year?
Yeah.
Awesome. No exact publisher to announce yet?
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay, cool. Well, we will definitely I hope you'll come on again to promote the book when it comes out.
I would love to.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Is there anything we haven't talked about that you'd like to talk about?
No, actually, we've covered all kinds of stuff. This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming on. This is fantastic. Is there anywhere that we should point people to find you online?
Well, most of my online activity these days is on the PRC History Group website, so prchistory.org, HPRC, Physicians Politics.